Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 95th commemoration of the Day of Remembrance for the victims of the Pontian Greek genocide by the Ottoman Empire during the early part of the 20th century. This weekend's events, including tonight, are planned by the Pontian Federation of the USA and Canada, along with local societies, Pontian Society Komnoini of New York, Pontian Society Pontos of Norwalk, Connecticut, and the Holy Institution of Panagia Soumela in West Milford, New Jersey. We would like to thank the Consulate General of Greece in New York, the Permanent Mission of Greece to the UN, and the Greek Press and Communication Office for graciously hosting tonight's events. In particular, we want to express our appreciation to Mr. Nicholas Papakonstantinou and his staff, our host for the evening. First, we would like to start with Father John Papakonstantinou from the parish of Elias Neofytides in Brooklyn for the invocation.
Βασιλεύ ουράνιε παράκλητε το πνεύμα της αληθείας, ο πανταχού παρών και τα πάντα πληρών, ο θησαυρός των αγαθών και ζωής χορηγός, ελθέ και εσκήνωσον ημίν και καθάρισον ημάς από πάσης κυλίδος και σώσον αγαθέτας ψυχάς ημών. Δόξα Πατρί και Υιό και Αγίο Πνεύματι και νυν και αεί και στους αιώνας των αιώνων. Αμήν. Χριστέ ο Θεός ημών, ευλόγησον ημάς, στήριξον ημάς, οδήγησον ημάς εις πάνεργων αγαθών, για να δοξάζετε δια ημών. Πάντοτε το όνομά σου το Άγιον, του Πατρός και του Υιού και του Αγίου Πνεύματος, νυν και αεί και στους αιώνες των αιώνων. Αμήν. Χριστός ανέστη εκ νεκρών, θανάτω θάνατο πατήσας και της εν τη μνήμη μας η ζωή χαρισάμενος. Ιαν και ευλογίαν σε όλους σας.
Next, we would like to invite Anastasia Molokidis, who will read a message from Archbishop Dimitrios.
Σας συγχαίρω για την οργάνωση των εκδηλώσεων, οι οποίες θα αποτίσουν φόρο τιμής στα θύματα της γενοκτονίας των Ελλήνων του Πόντου. Τη μνήμη αυτή οφείλουμε να διαφυλάξουμε στην εθνική συνείδηση του λαού μας ως τμήμα αναπόσπαστο της νεωτέρας ιστορίας του έθνους μας και ως γεγονός που θα διδάσκει ότι η θυσία των προγόνων μας μένει πάντοτε άσβεστη στη συλλογική μνήμη μας και οδηγεί τις αποφάσεις και τις ενέργειές μας στο παρόν και στο μέλλον.
Now we would like to invite our host for the evening, Mr. Papakonstantinou, for his welcoming statement.
Consul of Greece and friend of Mano Happy, distinguished members of academia, President of the Federation of Greek Association of Major, of City of New York City, of area of New York, members of the press, and dear friends. I deeply honored to welcome you here tonight to commemorate what has been, this is the second year that we do here, and I hope we establish a good tradition of holding this solemn commemoration of the genocide of the Pontian Greeks, or of the Greeks of Pontus. It's an honor to have you all here, and especially recognizing Thea Haller, that already has been recognized, and express my deep condolences, and also very solemnly to remind you that unfortunately this year we lost the grandmother of Pontus, of the Greek Pontus, and we're all deeply saddened because through her life that was the most illustrious and bright paradigm of a survival, and a lady that really did honor the old Pontian Greeks. We're deeply proud and deeply cognizant of the very importance of Thea Haller's book that presented for the first time to the world the genocide in a way that the Americans and the rest of the world could understand. And I cannot but come to the day to, what has happened in modern day Turkey, in Soma, outside of Smyrna, with the explosion of the mining. It's because the Turkish, and I do recognize Professor Aksan, Prime Minister of Turkey, is the one that very recently he did ask, or he did offer a haphazard type of sorry that, what happened to the Armenians, because, like they did suffer, but also, the Turkish population and the Turks also were equally suffered through, some hard times, and, I guess there was some kind of an aberration of history, but it was a backhanded type of sorry, which a lot of people, run to say, well, it's a first step. For me, it was very characteristic that the same Prime Minister, Mr. Erdogan, the other day, with about close to 300 miners dead, he hit, I guess, the internet, and what he had to say was that when those things do happen, especially, in minings and in this type of mining, there are accidents. Regardless of the 300 people, he didn't have, a word of sorry or to apologize, given that 10 days before, there was a very damning report that, the security of that mining site was really, it needed either to be closed or not to continue working. So, with all this, I think, there is a very uphill road for you until, the Greek Parliament has recognized in 1994 the genocide of the Greek Pontian Greeks, but a lot has to be done in order to establish, make it, a historical fact that it is, that there was a genocide between, well, some, they say 1914 to 1923, including when there was the exchange of the populations. Anyway, there is from, I guess, roughly 1908 to 1924, that probably there happened in 3 ways the genocide of the Pontian Greeks. That has to be historically established, to be made known to the rest of the world, historically, not as a footnote or to some, very, how can I say, partial historians, but to be a mainstream, to get in the history books that that thing happened, it was a genocide, there was no less, no more than what it really was. And with that, I'm very humbled that we have a distinguished panel of this, people that will talk to us about it. And I do extend a very warm welcome to our premises. And on behalf of my colleagues and also, the tourist office, that we are under the same roof, extend a very warm welcome to you all, and hope to see you around this time, because May 19th is the day of commemorate the genocide of Pontian Greeks. To see you around this time next year in this very place. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now we would like to have Manos Koumbarakis, Consul of the Republic of Greece in New York, to say a few words.
Εδεσιμότατε, αξιότιμοι καλεσμένοι, κυρίες και κύριοι. Σήμερα τιμούμε με σεβασμό και συγκίνηση την μνήμη των θυμάτων της γενοκτονίας των Ελλήνων του Πόντου. Κάθε χρόνο εκπληρώνουμε ένα ηθικό, ιστορικό και εθνικό καθήκον, αποτείοντας φόρο τιμής στους χιλιάδες δολοφονηθέντες συμπατριώτες μας, καθώς επίσης και σε αυτούς οι οποίοι με βαρβαρότητα ξεριζώθηκαν από τις πατρογονικές εστίες τους. Ο ποντιακός ελληνισμός, παρά τη μεγάλη αυτή τραγωδία, την σκληρή προσφυγιά, κατάφερε με εφόδια την φιλοπατρία του, την ψυχική του δύναμη και την εργατικότητά του να κρατήσει ζωντανά τα ήθη και τα έθιμα του Πόντου και να μεγαλουργήσει σε όλα τα μήκη και πλάτη της γης. Σήμερα οφείλουμε να σταθούμε με ευλάβεια μπροστά στο μεγαλείο της ηρωικής θυσίας των Ελλήνων του Πόντου και να αναλογιστούμε το βάρος που κληρονομήσαμε. Να αγωνιστούμε για την αποκατάσταση της μνήμης τους, επιδιώκοντας συστηματικά την αναγνώριση της ιστορικής αλήθειας. Το χρωστάμε στους χιλιάδες νεκρούς και πρόσφυγες. Η μνήμη είναι υποχρέωση όλων, όχι μόνο για να διατηρήσουμε ζωντανές και να μεταλαμπαδεύσουμε στα παιδιά μας την ιστορία, τον πολιτισμό και τις παραδόσεις του Πόντου, αλλά κυρίως για να αποτρέψουμε αποτρόπαια ανάλογα εγκλήματα να διαπραχθούν στο μέλλον σε βάρος άλλων λαών ή πληθυσμών. Καθώς η γενιά των διασωθέντων μεγαλώνει και οι μαρτυρίες από τα ίδια τα θύματα λιγοστεύουν, τα λόγια εκείνων των εναπομείνοντων πια ανθρώπων αποτελούν παρακαταθήκη για τις μελλοντικές γενιές. Η πρόσφατη απώλεια της γιαγιάς του Πόντου, Σάνο Χάλο, η οποία μέσα από τα γραπτά της και το βίο της ενσαρκώνει την διαδρομή των Ποντίων, υπενθυμίζει σε όλους μας την βαρύτητα των λόγων της και καθιστά επιτακτική την ανάγκη μνήμης και μηδενικής ανοχής σε παρόμοιες πράξεις τη σήμερον ημέρα. Για να πετύχουμε τον στόχο αυτό, οφείλουμε να εργαστούμε όλοι μαζί για να κυριαρχήσουν στον σύγχρονο κόσμο οι αξίες της ειρήνης, της ελευθερίας και της δικαιοσύνης. Είναι υποχρέωση και δικαίωμα συλλογικό που αφορά καθέναν από εμάς. Σας ευχαριστώ.
We will now have a small musical and video presentation titled Την Πατρίδα με έχασα, which means I lost my homeland, written by Christos Anatoniadis, music and letra by Kostas Siamidis, and lyrics by Yanni Koutidis and Achilleas Vasiliadis.
Η λύρα το πολιορκεί. Το δοξάρι βγαίνει από το θικάρι και ξεθάβει μνήμες. Στον Πόντο. Καραντενής το λένε τα αδέρφια της ψυχής.
Our first speaker for the evening will be Dr. Tanir Aksham, Chair of the Armenian Genocide Studies at Clark University. His subject for the evening will be Ottoman Genocide as a Demographic Policy. Historian and sociologist Tanir Aksham, one of the first Turkish intellectuals to acknowledge and openly discuss the Armenian genocide, holds the only endowed chair dedicated to research and teaching on this subject. As Robert Armand and Marian Kaluzian and Stefan and Marian Rugar, professors of Armenian Genocide Studies at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, he is committed to research, teaching, and training future scholars. An outspoken advocate of democracy and free expression since his student days at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, he is internationally recognized human rights activist. During the mid-1970s, Aksham was active with pro-democratic student groups in the wake of Turkey's 1971 coup. As editor-in-chief of Devrimci Gençlik, Revolutionary Youth, the student journal of the Ankara movement of leftist Democrats, he received a prison sentence of 8 years, 9 months, and 20 days, with an additional 3 years of probation. During his trial, Amnesty International adopted him as a prisoner of conscience. After a year of imprisonment, he escaped Ankara Central Prison and received political asylum in Germany. In 1991, as part of its effort to join the European Union, the Turkish government repealed the laws restricting freedom of expression that were the basis for his prosecution. With his record clear and the statute of limitation on his prison escape expired, he returned to Turkey but found it impossible to work there on the history of mass violence. Aksham received his PhD in 1996 from the University of Hanover with dissertation titled Turkish Nationalism and the Armenian Genocide on the background of the military tribunals in Istanbul between 1919 and 1922. He moved to the United States in 2000 and served as visiting scholar at the University of Michigan for a year, and as a visiting associate professor of history at the University of Minnesota from 2002 to 2008. In response to criticism about his 2008 appointment at Clark University, Strassler Center Director Professor Deborah Dorff responded that ethnic or religious identity is not crucial to any appointment, and that Clark hires the best scholars in the pool. He has more than 10 scholarly books that have been published on the Armenian genocide and Turkish nationalism in several languages. His most well-known are A Shameful Act, the Armenian Genocide and the Question of Turkish Responsibility, Judgment at Istanbul, the Armenian Genocide Trials, with Vrahan Dradian, and Young Turks' Crime Against Humanity, the Armenian Genocide and Ethnic Cleansing in the Ottoman Empire. His book, Young Turks' Crime Against Humanity, won a Mesa Albert Hourani Book Award for 2013, Best Book of the Year. And the journal Foreign Affairs chose the same title as one of the best books on the Middle East in 2012. Dr. Tanya Shah.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and it's really a great pleasure for me to be here and to commemorate the Pontian Genocide with you. My talk today will be on the Ottoman Genocide of Christians. Today I'm here to speak about the Ottoman Genocide as a demographic policy. I think this title is the best contextualization for the forced deportation, the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Greeks from 1913 to 1924. Let me begin with an observation. The last century of the Ottoman Empire, especially the period between 1878 and 1924, was characterized by a series of forced mass deportations, expulsions, ethnic cleansings, and the genocides. The Armenian genocide might represent the pinnacle of this period. However, the ethnic cleansing of Greeks in 1913 and 14, the genocide against Assyrians during the war years, and genocide against Pontus Greeks in 1921-22 are as important as the Armenian genocide. They occurred as a part of the same process. I think it is fair for us to use the term Ottoman genocide to describe the period of 1878 until to 1924. All of these mass deportations, massacres, and genocides carried out by one state. They represented the policy of the Ottoman administration, and each event was interrelated with the other. Despite this, until recently, with some exceptions to the contrary, all of these events have been analyzed and discussed as separate social phenomena without much contextualization. Each ethnic group, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, developed a historiography confined to its own history and never in connection with other mass crimes of the same era and region. There have been some limited attempts in recent years to explain the entire process within the broader context of Ottoman demographic policy, but for the most part, the scholars working in these fields stayed within their own niche field of inquiry. To formulate this in another way, even in cases where there were attempts to contextualize or pull the different cases together, this has been done for the most part by placing these different events next to each other as separate entities in a comparative perspective, what we call it, rather than trying to explain them as evidence of one interconnected process as one history. My suggestion today is that we develop a new historiography, new understanding of the period, and start talking about Ottoman genocide of Christians. I will present today a short glimpse of the period 1913-18 and show how the policies against Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians are strongly interrelated. They were not isolated acts, but part of a comprehensive policy implemented by one government. They were carried out as a part of a general plan which could be called demographic policy or ethnic cleansing of Anatolia, and it was a policy of expulsion of the Christians from Anatolia. The main goal of this policy was to ensure the formation of a homogeneous Anatolia, an Anatolia with a majority Turkish Muslim population. This policy was implemented as a general resettlement plan between 1913-18 and continued against the Pontus Greeks in the year 1921-22 and finalized with the Post-Population Exchange Agreement 1924. The elimination of the Christians, however, population was central in this plan, but it was not the only component. The other component was focused towards Muslim population of non-Turkish origin, such as Kurds, Arabs, and the migrants from Balkan. They were also relocated and dispersed among the Turkish majority for the purpose of ensuring assimilation with the latter. For the period of 1913-18, this policy resulted in a complete reconfiguration of the ethnic makeup of Anatolia. The estimated 17 million people who lived in Anatolia at the time were so uprooted that by the end of this period, at least 1/3 of them, around 5 million of them, either being resettled somewhere else, deported, like to Greece, or annihilated. I will cover this with 8 short characteristics of this policy. Point 1. Available Ottoman documents from the Ottoman Archive in Istanbul shows that this plan began to be implemented first in the Aegean region against the Greeks in 1913 and the spring of 1914, before the First World War I. The Ottoman losses during the Balkan War were a major triggering point. After the war. The Ottomans lost 83% of their landholding in Europe and 69% of their population. As a result, the Ottoman authorities were faced with a huge wave of Muslim immigrants from Balkan. They agreed to exchange population with Greece, 1913 and 14. The first measures against the Greeks on the Aegean coast followed a 2-track communication and operational system. On the surface, the Ottoman government had official population exchange agreement with Greece, according to which Muslims and Christians would be exchanged and resettled in their respective villages. On the other hand, a special organization established within the Defense Ministry carried out the illegal operations, which would include forcibly emptying the Greek villages by way of attacks on villages, massacre, and plunder. The concrete preparation of these plans was made at the beginning of 1914. The appointment of Enver Pasha to the Ministry of War in January 1914 especially was an important turning point in this regard. The Ottoman army was reorganized. The special organization was also established, at least reorganized during these periods. The task of the special organization was to separate the loyals, this is the Muslim Turks, from the traitors, these were the Greeks. In the word of one of the leaders of this special organization, the non-Muslims were called an internal Timur, whose purging was a matter of national importance, from him. The policies that were set in motion against the Greeks between 1913 and 1914 were forerunners of the subsequent wartime deportation against Armenians and Assyrians. We can easily argue that the policies against the Greeks in 1913-14 were a trial run for the Armenian-Assyrian deportations and killings in 1915 and 17. The American ambassador to Istanbul, Henry Morgenthau, drew attention to the fact that the methods used during the Armenian genocide were similar to those used throughout the period of Greek expulsions. Quote from Morgenthau: "The Turks employed the same methods against both Greeks and Armenians. They took them into the Ottoman army, then transferred them to the labor battalions, where thousands of Greek soldiers died from cold, hunger, and other deprivations, just like the Armenians. The Greeks everywhere were organized into groups, then under the promised protection of Turkish gendarmes were generally transported by food to the inner region of Anatolia." End quote. What Morgenthau could not know, of course, was this time a new government, the nationalists in Ankara, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, used exactly the same methods against the Pontus Greeks.
arrest of community leaders, like in Armenian case, April 1915, where they were put on trials and hanged, and the separation of able-bodied men who were soon killed, and then the third phase of the putting the women and children on death marches. It was like following a certain playbook with all the state laid out. Point 2, the deportation and resettlement of the entire Anatolian population during 1913-18 was not only the result of a preconceived comprehensive plan. Based on Ottoman archival materials, I can discern 4 different causes that were driving it. Number 1, the Christians of Anatolia were perceived as existential threats to the nation, so forced deportation and extermination was taken as the main tactic of choice. As a result of this policy, the Armenians and the Greek villages were emptied, and a new resettlement policy was developed, and the areas vacated by Christians were filled with Muslim immigrants who had come from Balkans and Caucasus. This is the number 1 planned resettlement policy. Number 2, deportation for military reasons. Deportation of some Nestorians, 1914, from east to west, or deportation of Greeks on the coastal areas, especially in 1916 and 17, were done on the basis of military objectives. The first Armenian deportations between February and April of 1915 from the Cilicia inside Anatolia would fit into this category also. Number 3, deportations for political reasons. Arabs and some Kurdish tribes were deported for this reason. Some Arab families and important individuals from Syria were considered a threat because they were capable of and possessed the potential to organize insurrections. Another group deported for political reasons during that period was the Jews of Palestine. There was a suspicion that they might form alliances with the British and were therefore deported to other regions during that period. 4th, deportation and resettlement of Muslims as a result of exigencies of the war. Kurds especially had escaped the Eastern war zone ahead of Russian army. This unexpected escape became an important part of the demographic policy. The number of Muslims who had been resettled in the new areas during 1915-18 were around 1 million. And they were resettled without any problem, but in the resettlement of Armenians and the other Christians, we know they were massacred. Point 3. Before implementing this general new population and resettlement plan, the Ottoman authorities created maps of every region showing the ethnic demographic areas of these regions. They not only created an ethnic map from every region, but also a social map. A social map detailing the education, language, and economic conditions of different ethnic groups and their relations between them. For example, here is a quote from a telegram to different provinces, 1916. Quote, "There is a need for the procurement of 2 logs in which the national identities of the population for each administrative unit from counties to village is shown." End quote. Another quoted telegram, dated from the Ottoman archive, July 20, 1915, and sent to all provinces, vilayets, and local administrations, demanded that a map showing, quote, "the national identities of population, both past and present, in all administrative units down to the village level be sent immediately," end quote. There are dozens of similar documents requesting different informations in every region. Just one more example for the Greek case. In 1916, the Interior Ministry was requesting, quote, "the procurement and dispatch of a log of the names of the villages set free in Marmara Coast, along with the number of Greeks deported from them and the localities." It should be sent immediately to Istanbul. So we can also learn from the Ottoman documents that the priests, the Greek priests, Armenian priests, Assyrian priests, and the rabbis, the Jewish rabbis, and other officials from these non-Muslim communities, the Greek community leaders, for example, they were also responsible for providing information on their community's demographic structure and population fluctuations. According to Ottoman documents, failing to do so could result in being subject to punishment. Point 4. As part of this demographic policy, towards end of 1913, Ottoman government created a new regulation, what they call Nizamname, in May 1913, and established a special department within Interior Ministry, Department of Immigration and Resettlement, towards end of 1913. One important aspect of this May regulation was renaming of entire Christian villages as part of Turkification policy. After the expulsion of Armenians and Assyrians in 1915, they accelerated this renaming process. These measures were carried out mostly by the provincial administrative commissions and were not well organized, actually. In order to stabilize this process, Enver Pasha, the Minister of Defense, issued an instruction, the document is in Ottoman archive today, January 15, 1916, and these instructions restated the order to change all names of towns, villages, mountains, rivers, etc. that had non-Islamic names into Turkish. The telegram also emphasized that this renaming process should be completed as soon as possible. This process, however, created enormous problems during the war years. They couldn't communicate with each other with these new names. So they stopped the process and postponed these after the war. I'm from Ardahan, Kars. I still remember 1970s, they were still trying to change the Georgian, Armenian, and Greek names of the villages around. And I know these names today by heart. Point 5. The resettlement of Muslims began immediately after expulsion of the Christian for the purpose of repopulating. We can infer from Ottoman documents that the time between vacating and resettlement in some cases were not more than 1 week. This also shows how really preemptive, how they planned beforehand. It was not only a result of the war exigencies, they were planned ahead, emptied the Greek villages or Armenian villages and settled within 1 week other Muslim in the same villages. Point 6. The main goal of the resettlement policy of different Muslim ethnic groups was their forced assimilation or Turkification. In the Ottoman documents, the terms temsil or temessül, which are singular and plurals of the term assimilation, are openly used. In order to achieve the assimilation, the Muslim groups were separated from their religious leaders and were settled in different areas. Not only were the leaders placed away from their group, but the group itself was dispersed throughout Anatolia. For example, in a telegram sent by Interior Minister Talat Pasha, dated May 2nd, 1916, it is clearly stated that the intention of the resettlement policy of the Kurds was to make the Kurds forget their ethnic and cultural identity. Thus, they should not be resettled in areas that would allow them to retain their national identity. It is clearly stated that in order to stop the Kurds from maintaining their tribal lifestyles, their leaders should be relocated to areas away from their people. For example, in a telegram, May 4th, 1916, the purpose of policy was written very clearly saying that the Kurds should abandon their language and cultural habits, period. Point 7. The documents explicitly show that the government ordered the regional authorities to ensure that any relocated group not exceed 5 or 10% of the original Muslim population. Some scholars, such as myself, learned of the 5 and 10% policy from an Ottoman document in early 1990s, and we dismissed these as a cover-up attempt, a smoke screen they never planned to resettle Christians on the 5–10% population ratio. Now, however, new documents from the Ottoman archives indicates that this was not in fact a cover-up, but rather a calculated policy applied not only to Armenians, but also to Greeks, Arabs, Kurds, Albanians, Bosnians, and the others. In some other telegrams, they also stated that in the region where Armenians or Greeks did not constitute more than 5 or 10% of the population, no relocation was necessary. For example, in a telegram sent to Çanakkale in 1916, the following is ordered. Quote, since the reported number of Greeks and Armenians do not appear to be at a degree deemed excessive, it is appropriate that they be permitted to continue to reside there. So, in each region, government kept continual track of population percentages, constantly asking the number of both expelled groups and remaining relocated groups. For example, in a telegram to Janik province, 1916, in the Pontus area, they asked how many Greeks had been moved out of the province where they had been sent and how many remained still in that province. In region where the Armenians were deported, this is the Syrian and Iraq area, the government did not want Armenians more than 10% of the Muslim population of the location. In several telegrams sent to the Syrian and Iraq provinces, it was Ottoman provinces, it is clearly stated that the Armenians' population there should never exceed 10%. So, according to Ottoman statistics, the number of deported Armenians were around 1.2–1.3 million. So the Muslim population in Syria and Iraq, where the Armenians were supposed to be settled, was around 2 million. So, if indeed the Armenians were not exceed 10% of the indigenous population in Syria and Iraq, with round numbers, the 10% ceiling must have allowed for an influx of no more than 200,000 Armenian settlers. The question is very simple. What happened to the Armenians in these regions who were over 10% limit? The calculation and answer is very quite simple. According to Ottoman official policy, it was necessary to reduce the number of Armenians around 1.3 million to approximately 200,000. Do you know how many Armenians survived in Syria and Iraq? Approximately 150–200. It was really very well calculated demographic policy. So this is really what happened, and this explains us also why in summer of 1916 in Derzor, the Auschwitz of Armenian genocide, there were a second wave of massacre where they exterminated more than 200,000 Armenians. Point 8, this is the last point. One of the purposes behind removing the Christian population from Anatolia was to develop a Turkish Muslim bourgeois class. In furtherance of this purpose, the properties of Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians were either sold at bargain basement prices or distributed for free to Muslims. Ottoman authorities issued different laws and regulations in this regard. In a nutshell, these laws and regulations mandated that a special commission be established, that the Armenians and Greek properties be registered in a special ledger, and that some of these properties be sold by auction. Crops and livestock were to be treated the same way. Fields were supposed to be harvested and the crops sold with the proceeds from the sale to be recorded in these ledgers too. So what actually happened to the properties that were confiscated from Greeks and Armenians during the war years? Based on Ottoman documents, I could show that Ottoman authorities handled the confiscated movable and non-movable properties in a very systematic way. There were 4 chief ways that these resources were processed. First, they were distributed among the Muslims in the region to create a Muslim bourgeois class. with enough capital that could presumably rival and replace what had been lost with the expulsion of the Christian bourgeoisie. Second, they were given to Muslim immigrants who resettled in Greek and Armenian villages. Third, they were used to cover military expenses during the war year. And the fourth, some of the substantial buildings were repurposed for government uses, such as prisons, schools, or hospitals. If you go to Turkey, if you travel throughout Turkey, in each city there is an Atatürk house, they call it. And these are basically confiscated houses from Greeks and Armenians, nothing else. So this is the other way of using of these properties. I will conclude my talk here by returning to the main point. While there were some occasional disruptions in the policies that were followed regarding the Christians, there were fluctuations, of course, throughout the history. But between 1878 and 1924, the Ottomans nevertheless exhibited a very clear consistency. After the Balkan War, especially 1913 in particular, without making much distinction between Greeks, Assyrians, or Armenians, the elimination of all Christians from everywhere in Anatolia constituted backdrop of this policy. The Pontus Genocide of 1921-22 and the population exchange 24 were the last chapter of this process. This is why I call it the Ottoman Genocide against Christians. The Republic of Turkey, which was established in 1923, owes its existence to the extermination of Christians from Anatolia. If the genocide of Pontus Greeks and Assyrians, not to mention the Armenian genocide, continues to be denied today in the face of a mountain of contrary evidence, the most fundamental reason for this is that modern Turkey was constructed on top of this annihilation. And denial allows Turkish government to perpetuate the myth of an exclusive legacy over these lands. If Turkey cares about its reputation and wants to be considered a respected member of Europe, and I really want my country, my state, be part of a respected member of Europe and civilized countries in the world at large, it must first and foremost confront this dark chapter in its founding and make honesty and integrity a principle of governance. I thank you for listening.
We will continue this evening with a poetry reading by Stefanos Papadopoulos. He will be reading from his book of poems, The Black Sea. Stefanos Papadopoulos was born in North Carolina and raised in Paris and in Athens. He is the author of 3 books of poems, Lost Days, Hotel Dieu, and The Black Sea, as well as the editor and co-translator with Katerina Angelaki-Rook of Derek Walcott's selected poems into Greek. Vuestro enaro y nostra Fagiri a bilingual selection from Papadopoulos' 3 collections, was published in Italy and Switzerland by Casa Grande Editions in 2012, translated by Matteo Campanoli. He attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and spent a year at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, before graduating with a BA in classical archaeology from UNC. In 1998, his work attracted the attention of Derek Walcott, who invited him to attend the first Rat Island Foundation seminar in St. Lucia. His poems and translations have appeared in journals such as The New Republic, The Yale Review, Poetry Review, Scan Magazine, and numerous international journals and anthologies. He has translated works of Greek poets Katerina Angelaki-Rook, Yannis Ritsos, Kostas Karoyakis, among others. His own work has been translated into Greek by Katerina Angelaki-Rook, Italian by Matteo Campanoli, and Spanish by Rodrigo Rojas. He has lectured and read at festivals around the world, such as Crossing Border Festival in Holland, the Foundation Nuraba in Chile, Oxford University, University of Heidelberg, the Signum Foundation in Venice, the Babel Festival in Barcelona, the North Carolina Literal Festival, among many others. In 2010, he was awarded a Civitella Ranieri Fellowship for the Black Sea. In 2014, he was awarded the Jeanette Payne Ballard Writers Prize. Today, Stefano will be reading poems from his most recent collection, The Black Sea, a long poem cycle about the Black Sea Greeks and their exodus from that region. The Black Sea explores the historic great catastrophe of the Pontian Greeks in Asia Minor in the 1920s through a series of monologues or voices from the past.
Thank you and good evening. Yes, as better. Just a quick thank you to the Federation and to Mr. Neofytides for his invitation. He found me by chance, I think. He contacted me by some miracle, found my poems and read The Black Sea, and I received this invitation. And I'd just like to say that I've done lots of readings, and I've never actually given a reading particularly to a Greek audience in particular, outside of Athens, of course. And it's a very moving experience for me to be here, for many reasons, as you can imagine. And I find it, the book, The Black Sea, began as an idea of an inherited memory. And I wasn't quite sure why, as a young man, I was so interested in this history of my family, having not experienced war or persecution or exile. And the only explanation I found was that there's some sort of memory that can be inherited somehow through the blood. It comes down through your DNA. I don't know quite how it's transferred. And that can lend itself to this sort of passion that everybody here has for a history that they perhaps didn't experience. And I think it's highly important that those sorts of memories are passed down through the generations so that people don't forget. So I'm just going to read you a few poems. This is Melanthe Speaks to God. All night the sea flutters like tin, ex voto for the sulphurous zone, dead as the mute black sky and the stars too thin. A wish on something falling sinks like lead. That's what I think. Made my wishes and wore the paint of icons on my lips. The priest intones that he who washes in the holy water is rid of lies. That's the language of men, full of solutions. I buried 3 children in the cold dawn by the roadside, without prayer or ablutions, and heaped the stones to hold their bodies down, and kept walking through that field of stolen corn, whose husks are paper crosses on the cairn. Rain over Trabzon, or Trapezunda. Heavy raindrops strike the water, a waver of dissolving sunlight below the clouds is a white line on a canvas of storm blue. The rain erases and renews itself in puddles that lean like oval mirrors on the promenade, where the priest hurries, robes lifted from his ankles, thin white ankles reflected in the rain pools. Dark sky over Trabzon, the mist filtering through streets exchanged like dirty banknotes, rubles, drachmas, lira passed hand to hand. The dog-eared corners wet with blood, bent by angry fingers, angry men with sadder wives, the streets of Trebizond, Trabzond, Trapezunda, washed by rain, but won't wash clean. The poet. He walks naked to the window, looks out across the city, the ancient walls, the trawlers cinched tight along the promenade, the dogs sleeping in clusters among the piled nets, and the first hint of light that arrives, messenger between the hours of sleep, thin line that holds the horizon to its edge, that holds his throat to the horizon, so that every vista is a lanyard over-tightened, a clothesline tied to the olive tree and swallowed by its bark, a dream he left that followed him in daylight, oil lamps burning for the blind, fireflies at dawn, Paine's logic, the lantern in the midday sun. He dresses slowly like the hangman. And I think, just for the Greek-speaking audience here, this book has been translated just recently. It hasn't been published yet in Greek, but I wrote it in English, of course, but these poems have all been translated by Katerina Angelakirou, who's a very well-known poet in Greece, if you don't know her. And I have this poem in Greek, and I'll read it in Greek for those of you who might be interested. Ο ποιητής στο λιμάνι. Του αρέσει να κατεβαίνει στο λιμάνι αργά το βράδυ, όταν τα παντζούρια στην πόλη είναι κλειστά και τίποτα δεν αναπνέει άλλο από την φουσκοθαλασσιά, ενώ ο μηχανισμός των άστρων υπενθυμίζει και επαναλαμβάνει αυτά που ο ποιητής γνωρίζει, αλλά δεν μπορεί να εξηγήσει. Έναν τόπο πέρα από τις πονεμένες των ανθρώπων φωνές. Του αρέσει να ξαπλώνει με σωρούς δίχτυα, μαζί με σκύλους και φαντάσματα δελφινιών, παγιδευμένα από την απροσεξιά, τα πεταγμένα σκοινιά, από ένα δευτερόλεπτο όταν η χαρά γίνεται εγκατάλειψη και η εγκατάλειψη, όπως πάντα, μπαίνει στον χώρο της τραγωδίας. Και γι' αυτό του αρέσει να κατεβαίνει εκεί μόνος του και να αποκοιμιέται πάνω στα δίχτυα με τους σκύλους και την αποφορά της θάλασσας. This poem is called Amisos, which was obviously the Greek name for Samsunda. And this is where my grandfather was born, actually. And I made this trip on a motorcycle. I traveled all through the Black Sea and all through Turkey in 2007 and explored all the villages of these regions, and then made my way back along the southern coast of the Black Sea to see these places. And actually, I was the first I was the first male in my family who made that trip, because my father and my uncles who were very, very much taken by this story and were unable to go. They couldn't psychologically make that trip. And I had a conversation earlier tonight with somebody who we had the same. We talked about this. They were unable to make that journey because it was too painful for them, and possibly because I was from another generation. It was easier for me to go back, you know. So in a sense, that trip was a trip back for my whole family, for my whole ancestry. So Amisos, Samsun, 1922. Everything is beautiful and fatal in this port. The doors of the Greek houses swing in the wind. The scrape of soldiers' boots scar the quiet streets. At dusk, the sea goes mauve and the jetty melts into the water as the vowels rip from minarets and the muezzin's cry swims from one rooftop to the next. The evening prayer trapped by mountains, splashing back through the alleys toward the sea. Such sad confusion in that sound, when half the city kneels in praise while the other cringes. And in the flat harbor, the white bait rise to the surface by the thousands, dripping silver from the nets to feed the army, hungry from its work. And this poem is called Walking to Sebastia, or Sebastia, however you prefer to pronounce it. And this is a reference, of course, to the death marches. The light arrives in sullen masquerade, yet the body moves on built-in code, and the heart's dumb repetition drives them into deeper snow. They march and we'll keep marching till the last child dies and the mothers stop. Down the line, across unopened boxes, through the floods and fire that unfolds like a single flower in Sebastia, yet burns with a glutton's fervor, where the women walk like dead machines. A boar, psychopathic, blind, feeds face down in this trough where the sun won't go. And then I'll finish with a last poem called The Refugees. And of course, this is a reference to also to some of the images we saw in Smyrni with the boats in the harbor. The crowds walk down the paths to broken piers. Their eyes are tar where the moon's dull reflection rides. Last lamp of the Pontic kings, last light for the refugees before they board, before the oars tear the upset water, and the water swells against the oarlocks, spilling in hissing streams along the side. Some flail against it, filling their hats, returning the cold water to the sea, and others wait with folded hands. Their eyes shut out the moon and practice the last dream that floods in silence, which the sea covers and forgets. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker will be Dr. Pontian Genocide, historian and author. Tonight's subject for Dr. Genocide will be Turkish responsibility for the destruction of Smyrna in 1922. What do the American archives tell us? Dr. Genocide holds a PhD from Columbia University in Byzantine, Ottoman, and Balkan history. He was also a Genetius Fellow of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens and an educational counselor at the U.S. Consulate Fulbright office in Thessaloniki, where he also taught at Anatolia College. He has been a senior administrator at the City University of New York and taught courses in history and education at several universities in the New York City metropolitan area. Professor Genocide is also a fellow of the American Hellenic Institute in Washington, D.C. For more than 20 years, he has served in various senior positions in New York City Department of Education, where he currently works as part of the system's central administration. Our speaker is the author of 3 books, Navios, A Future Built Upon a Historical Tradition of Innovation and Excellence, American Accounts Documenting the Destruction of Smyrna, and Founded on Freedom and Virtue, documents illustrating the impact in the United States of the Greek War of Independence. In addition to many articles in scholarly journals in the fields of Byzantine and modern Greek history and education, his lecture tonight highlights some aspects of his research on the destruction of Smyrna and Turkish responsibility, recently published by Asia Minor and Fondos Hellenic Research Center in Chicago.
I guess I'll speak from here. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. By the way, the book that was referred to is published by the Pontians, who we're very grateful to, and Professor Akam is in it as well, the conference papers. I have to tell you that I owe this, let's see, slideshow. How do you get a full screen here on this?
From the beginning.
Some of you techies. Okay, great. I owe the slideshow, about 99% of it, to Mavropoulos and the Pontians in Chicago. They gave it to me. Oops, how do you make it stop? Can you make it stand still or click to move? How do you do that? Okay, I'll just click on the slides. Okay. First of all, I want to thank Gus Tsifilidis and the members of the Pontian Society for inviting me to address you tonight. There is no question that the Pontians are the most active Greeks in the United States, if not the world, in promoting a broader awareness of the genocide of Anatolian Greeks and Christians. As a historian, I am accustomed to studying and speaking about the past. However, the tragic events and the people we are here to remember are no mere academic exercise. For me, it's all personal, because I am the son of Anatolians. My mother, Eli, was born in Budza, a beautiful suburb of Smyrna, one of Hellenism's great cosmopolitan centers, which tragically, like so many others, no longer exists. I came to this subject because of a key, the key to our lost home, and because the catastrophe, was something that I learned about as a child in a very personal way. My grandparents always hoped to go home to their Chameni Patrida, but they never did. And today I will show you something that no one has seen in 90 years. This refugee document was issued in Chios on October 31st, 1922. And the photograph is of the Linakis family, including my mom. That's the one being held in the front there, at age 2, shortly after they fled the Great Fire and the slaughter they narrowly escaped. For me, the document brings a grim reality to the events discussed here. In the time that I have, I will try to do 3 things. I will briefly summarize some of the indisputable facts of what happened in Smyrna and its general context. I will discuss the evidence in the American archives concerning Turkish responsibility and motivation for the Great Fire and U.S. policy. And 3, I will try to give you some idea of the progress that has been made and the work that still needs to be done concerning the study and recognition of the genocide of Anatolian Greeks. One also needs to recognize a broad historical reality that is often ignored. This reality is that the Greek communities in Asia Minor, like Budza and Smyrna, no longer exist, not because of some natural disaster, war, economic circumstance, or voluntary migration, but because of a deliberate, systematic policy which historians have identified as Turkification. And a previous speaker gave us lots of details along those lines. While today we are discussing only the 20th century, it is important to recognize that what took place at that time was the final stage of a larger historical process that had gone on for centuries. In Asia Minor, Turkification and de-Hellenization began during the 14th century. And this earlier phrase has been studied in great detail by my friend and colleague, Spiros Vryonis, who has also illuminated the modern destruction of the Greek community of Constantinople in 1955. Today, there are less than 5,000 ethnic Greeks left in what constitutes modern Turkey. In fact, let me remind you that even in my own lifetime, during the summer of 1974, it happened again with the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, where a portion of that historically Hellenic island has also been Turkified. And my friend and colleague, Professor Ioannidis, is here, who's written a detailed book on the Turkification of Cyprus. Now let me briefly turn to the facts of what happened in Smyrna. The first thing that we must always recognize, oh, by the way, I have a handout, and now it's frozen. Oh, no, here it is. Okay. This is a illustration of the loss of life in a recent book that's come out, The Genocide of Ottoman Greece, edited by Tessa Hoffman. It gives you some idea of the numbers and the range of destruction. You can hand them out. And on the other side, I've got some key American documents. I had to limit it to 2 pages, so I didn't give you all the documents. The first thing we must always recognize is that internal Greek politics, especially the disunity between royalists and Venizelos, played a critical role. The Greek state that won permission to land troops and occupy part of Anatolian Turkey in 1919 was a divided country, exhausted by decades of war, with a weak economy, and a dependency on foreign powers, especially Great Britain. The purpose was to protect the large Christian minorities in those areas from further Turkish slaughter. Smyrna was second only to Constantinople for its wealth, cosmopolitan lifestyle, and large foreign community. I've got a few visuals here of what Smyrna looked like. Like I said, I owe them all to our friends in Chicago. For the Turks, for cosmopolitan, it became the administrative center of this new Greek administration. For the Turks, this was a great shock. For although they considered Smyrna a city of foreigners, the Greek occupation was a great blow to their national pride and a threat to their national existence. While the Greek military in Asia Minor fought among themselves and made many strategic blunders, a new Turkish leader, Kemal Ataturk, turned Turkish defeat into victory and not only covered up previous crimes, but conducted new waves of massacres and deportations. This is Smyrna during its better days. Kemal established so-called courts of independence, which executed thousands of Greeks. For example, 60 persons a day were hanged in the Pontus during September 1921, according to British sources. A reign of terror was renewed throughout Turkish-held Anatolia, during which hundreds of non-Muslim villages and towns were burned and thousands of Christians were slaughtered and deported, meaning marched out to die. 3 major events, a kind of a perfect storm, enabled Kemal to succeed. Number 1, in 1920, King Alexander of Greece died, and Greece brought back pro-German King Constantine. Number 2, the victors of World War I realized that there were great economic advantages, especially oil, to be gained in Turkey. And number 3, the Greek army was utterly defeated and collapsed in Anatolia. As these defeated and disorganized Greek troops fled to the coast for evacuation, they also burned villages and murdered civilians, which further enraged Turkish vengeance. Many thousands of Christians fled to Smyrna and its suburbs, and it is estimated that more than 300,000 people were concentrated there by September 1922. Actually, I think it was many more. I think it was closer to 500,000. Somebody asked me why I think that. I'll tell you. Given all of this background, it should come as no surprise that Smyrna, despite its large European population and status as Turkey's most cosmopolitan city, was dealt with in the same way as the rest of the Christian communities of Asia Minor. What was different, however, was that it all took place while the world watched, and powerful military resources, in fact 27 European ships, including 3 American destroyers, stood by in the harbor, watched, and let it all happen. The destruction of Smyrna and the murder of a large portion of its population made worldwide headlines 92 years ago. A martyr's death was also the fate of Chrysostomos, the city's Greek metropolitan and spiritual leader, who was literally torn to pieces by a Turkish mob. Practically all of the American and British newspapers of the time held the army of Kemal Ataturk directly responsible for the massacre of thousands and the setting of the Great Fire. In fact, Kemal himself was present and in total control of his forces. The fire and the massacres were part of an organized plan. The phrase, "Turkey for the Turks," is heard over and over again in the sources. Yet even while the ruins of this ancient Christian city were still smoldering, the despicable minions of commercial interest worked hand in hand with the Turkish government to minimize the tragedy and absolve the Kemalists of all responsibility. For in 1922, Turkey controlled the rich oil fields of Mosul, now part of Iraq, a precious prize which Kemal dangled before each of the Western powers. Today, the Turkish government still denies that any systematic massacres of Greeks and Armenians took place in Smyrna. And incredible as it may seem to some, it also claims that the fire that destroyed the city was deliberately set by Greeks or Armenians. What happened in the city is still controversial. However, two recently published studies on the subject, Giles Milton, Paradise Lost, Smyrna 1922, and Nikolaos Halmidis, a detailed article in the Karatis volume I mentioned earlier on the genocide, have added much information. The basic facts of what happened are the following, and this is all based on archival evidence. On September 8th, after all Greek troops had left the city, Kemal's nationalists entered and took over. The military authorities were in full control and assured the European representatives and the terrified population who had crowded into the city that everyone would be safe. The suburbs were attacked by organized chetas, irregular troops, and armed civilians who raped and murdered hundreds. Even Christian graves were opened and the bones of the dead defaced. Foreigners were also murdered in their homes, as we know from official and unofficial eyewitnesses. Churches and priests were special targets. One American professor who lived near a priest's home wrote that he saw the unfortunate cleric crucified on the door of his house in a Christ-like pose. An organized attack also began against the Armenian sections of the city, and people were murdered in their homes as organized mobs and regular troops supposedly searched for hidden weapons. During the next 4 days, the pillage spread and accelerated to all Christian cities of the large city. The fleet of foreign commercial and military ships in the harbor were instructed by their governments not to intervene or interfere with this Turkish slaughter. With only a few small exceptions, they watched what took place and only allowed those with foreign passports to leave. Prior to the Turkish entry, fearing massacres, U.S. Consul Horton had wired the State Department and asked for American mediation to protect minorities in the city. The U.S. government said no. Horton, however, took local independent action and gathered food and supplies, anticipating the starvation and hardships the refugees would suffer. The Americans actually did more philanthropic work than anybody else. Almost immediately, it became clear that Turkish troops were also gathering up any able-bodied Greek and Armenian men from all over the city. Those not immediately killed were put in what the sources call concentration camps. From there, they were either systematically murdered or placed in slave labor gangs and sent into the interior, where most died after numerous hardships. Young women and even girls from the American college were abducted, raped, and if not immediately murdered, placed in special houses for the pleasure of the conquering troops. Several American eyewitnesses attested this fact and said that they were invited by Turkish soldiers to come and see how well they dance. On the 13th of September, Turkish troops deliberately set fire to the European sections of the city and made sure that it spread through the use of petrol. Fleeing the flames, over 300,000 desperate and frightened and terrified refugees gathered along the city's long waterfront in order to escape the flames and beg the ships anchored in the harbor to let them escape by sea. Maybe we can make this a slideshow, let's see.
From the beginning.
From the beginning?
All the way, no, up until.
Oh, from the beginning, there we go. Okay. It'll run by itself? Great, thank you. The Turks set up guns and cavalry on both ends of the waterfront to make certain that no one could leave undetected, and then systematically rape, rob, and murder their victims at will. Instead of stopping the slaughter or picking up the thousands of victims who swam out to the ships, several ships played music in order to help drown out the screams coming from the shore. Not even foreign consulates were spared from the fire. Consul Horton had to flee the U.S. consulate as it was burning and left Smyrna aboard an American destroyer. Many eyewitness reports describe the horrible scene. I'll share a few with you. A British newspaper man reported what he saw from one of the ships. I quote, "What I see as I stand on the deck of the Iron Duke is an unbroken wall of fire, 2 miles long, in which 20 distinct volcanoes of raging flames are throwing up jagged, writhing tongues to a height of 100 feet. Against this curtain of fire, which blocks out the sky, are silhouetted the towers of the Greek churches, the domes of the mosques, and the flat, square roofs of the houses. All Smyrna's warehouses, business buildings, and European residences, with others behind them, are burned like furious torches. From this intensely growing mass of yellow-orange, the crimson fire pour up thick clotted coils of oily black smoke that hide the moon at its zenith. The sea glows a deep copper red, and worst of all, from the densely packed mob of many thousands of refugees huddled on the narrow quay, between the advancing fiery death and between the deep water in the front, they scream." This is how a French source described the scene. Thousands of unfortunate people, crowded along the waterfront, fell into the sea. A great part of the port has been filled with hundreds of corpses that one can walk on them. Those floating on water were finished off by Turks with swords and wood clubs. The most terrible of all is that this orgy of blood, disaster, and various other crimes took place under the eyes, frequently the spiteful smiles, and even the cheers of the foreign warships, or the official representatives of the foreign powers. The same French consul himself was invited to dinner, and he excused himself for his delay of a few minutes with these terrible words. "Because," he said, "the motor launch in which I was on my way from the French warship hit continuously upon the floating corpses of Greek women," and slowed him down. Horton, who also was at this dinner, because it was before he left, pitied himself for being a human being when he heard this. Finally, a British seaman recorded the following eyewitness account in his diary. "Rape and looting was now the order of the day in Smyrna, and human life was not worth a farthing. 2 young women were seized by the Turks, and after being raped, their breasts were cut off, and they were laid in the roadway. 2 Turks held a Greek while a third one ran his bayonet through the poor devil's stomach. Many bodies were hung by the neck to the trees, and the harbor was littered with dead bodies. With the approach of night, the panic increased, and so did the fire. And by midnight, 300,000 souls were between blazing Hades and the deep sea. Turkish cavalry were stationed to each end, so it was impossible to escape. The people were cut down right and left by the soulless devils who had broken their promise, and the scene can only be described as worse than hell. Shrieking women calling to unresponsive children who were beyond answering. Children of tender age calling for parents whose hearts had left their bloodstains on Turkish swords. Such were the horrible scenes witnessed. Now and again, a cavalryman would take a fancy to a young girl of 15 or 16, drag her away, and then a ghastly scream would tell its own story. Right along the seafront was a wall of unbroken fire with flames, 100 feet high, causing a lurid glow in the sky. End of quote. In the midst of this hell, which Consul Horton said it made him ashamed he was a member of the human race, there appeared a still anonymous, heroic Japanese captain who did not care about politics or commerce, but acted to save the lives of the innocent victims without regard to nationality, unlike all the other ships in the harbor who simply watched. Reports of other refugees being saved refer primarily to those who could prove foreign citizenship. By the time the fire began to smolder on the September 16th, there were still at least over 200,000 on the waterfront praying for ships to rescue them. At this point, the Turks realized that they could not kill Christians fast enough and deport enough people to make the minorities around Smyrna disappear. So Kemal issued an order that all Christians had to leave by the end of September or else be deported into the interior, which of course meant death. Horton and the American naval commander had repeatedly asked the Turks to allow Greek ships from the neighboring islands to sail into the harbor and pick people up. Permission was finally granted on September 23rd. It was at this point that a courageous young American, Asa Jennings, a YMCA man, played a heroic role. He found a large number of Greek ships anchored at the island of Mytilene, where he had gone for supplies. He was the right man in the right place at the right time. On his own, he convinced the Greek government that he was acting under official American orders. He made it up. And that the Turks would not attack the rescue fleet if they came into Smyrna flying no flag with an American naval escort. This is in fact what happened. Jennings led this rescue fleet with 8 ships on September 24th, which grew to 19 on September 26th. The last week of September was like a Greek Dunkirk. Using anything that could float, Admiral, in quotations, Jennings, Greek-American fleet succeeded in saving 140,000 souls, including my mother and her family. Official statistics indicate that about 213,000 Christians, mostly Greeks, were rescued from Smyrna by the deadline, which indicates that over 100,000 were slaughtered. The Turks searched everyone before letting them depart, and no male between the ages of 15 and 20 was allowed to leave. Sons, fathers, and brothers were torn from their families, most of whom were never seen again. By the time the Turkification process was over, similar rescue fleets picked up Christians from all over the Asia Minor coast. Over 1 million, mostly Greek refugees, had fled to Greece. To appreciate the impact upon poor and war-torn Greece, you have to understand that the entire population before this happened was about 3 million. Now they had to care for and integrate a huge number of destitute refugees, mostly elderly, women, and children. This is the so-called population exchange of 1923. Today, there should be no doubt about who burned Smyrna, why this was done, and why so many innocent people were massacred and expelled. Utilizing the U.S. National Archives, I have found several key official and originally secret documents that prove it, and show that the U.S. government knew this at the time and covered it up. I call this a kind of Smyrna-gate. I made it up based on Watergate. And it is the subject of my book and of the article that appears in the book that I held up earlier, published by the Pontian Society of Chicago. Now, if I have enough time, hopefully I do, I will describe to you three key pieces of evidence which prove that the U.S. government knew who burned the city and why. Document is a wire dispatch dated September 14th, the date of the outbreak of the Great Fire, which was sent to Admiral Bristol, who was the senior American diplomat in Turkey at the time, by Lieutenant A.S. Merrill, his naval intelligence officer in Smyrna. And I've given you copies of these documents, this wire. What does the wire say? It's dated, and these documents, by the way, when you look at them in the archives, they all have stamps, they all have dates on them. Bureaucracies sometimes are wonderful things because you find things that the people at the time didn't think about. And I know why Admiral Bristol let this document get to Washington. I'll tell you about it in a minute. But what does it say? It's a brief document. It's dated September 15th. The fire is still going on. Following from Smyrna, 14th, day before. M convinced Turks burned Smyrna, except Turkish section, conforming with definite plan to solve Christian minority problem by forcing allies evacuate Christian minorities. Believe they will now prepare for an attack on Constantinople, Merrill. The reason why I think Bristol sent it to Washington was because it had that information in it about the imminent attack on Constantinople, and this was something that at the time they were very concerned about. The second key document, which I haven't given you a copy of, confirms that the information concerning Turkish intentions, the loss of life, and the burning of the city actually reached the Secretary of State and was corroborated by other sources. The document is a telegram received and read by Hughes, the U.S. Secretary of State, and it was originally classified. The relevant sections read, confidential reports received from our many officials at Smyrna and British Foreign Office indicate that Turks burned the city in conformity with definite plan to solve the Christian minority problem by forcing the evacuation of the minorities. The return of several 100,000 Christians to their homes is apparently made impossible by the wholesale destruction of villages by retreating Greeks as well as by advancing Turks. Reports indicate heavy loss of American property in Smyrna. Native Americans are all safe. No further details received regarding missing naturalized citizens. 3 American destroyers are still in Smyrna, assisting relief workers and protecting the American property which escaped the fire. The reason why I know he read it was he was on vacation, and the undersecretary, a man by the name of Phillips, made notes that the secretary was on vacation and that he was going to bring all of this to his attention when he got back. This important classified document proves that the U.S. Secretary of State received information that was considered reliable shortly after the Great Fire, which indicated that the Turks had deliberately destroyed the city as a matter of policy. Furthermore, it states that the reports were numerous and supported by British confidential documentation. It corroborates the earlier wire that Lieutenant A.S. Merrill, the agent, the intelligence officer, and is also supported by something else. Merrill kept a diary, and this diary was sent to Washington as part of a whole bunch of stuff. Diary still unpublished. And in the diary, he confirms exactly what he said in the wire to Bristol. In fact, he gives a lot more details. The third, and in some ways the most important document, and you have the beginning of it there, I gave you a copy, concerning the destruction of Smyrna, is an undated, unofficial, and highly confidential, lengthy British document. It goes on for pages. An aide memoir that was sent to the State Department in early November 1922, or perhaps earlier. I will quote a small piece. His Majesty's ambassador is instructed to communicate unofficially to the United States government, notice unofficially, the accompanying copy of a preliminary report on the sacking of Smyrna from His Majesty's High Commissioner at Constantinople. It will be observed that the evidence contained therein all points to the conclusion that the European and native Christian quarters were systematically destroyed by the Turks as part of a deliberate policy. If the United States government are prepared to communicate in the same way any reports which may have reached them upon this subject, His Majesty's government will be glad to receive them. End of quote. We know that the U.S. government had similar information and responded to the British. However, they minimized what they knew and kept everything highly classified. Like the other Western powers, the Americans were in secret negotiations with Kemal over oil and other economic concessions and did not wish to risk offending him. Officially, the United States government declared that it could not know with certainty who was responsible for the fire, and kept the documents I have shared with you tonight secret and only known to a small circle of insiders. In fact, on the British, the response to the British, a man by the name of Dulles, who was the head of the Near East section, made lots of notes on what to send, what not to send, etc. And I found those notes in the archives, and they're very interesting. About how perplexed they were, how they were going to put the best kind of spin they could on everything. Even Henry Cabot Lodge, a prominent U.S. senator with ties to the Greek-American community, was given the public line when he sent an inquiry dated February 24, 1923 to the State Department, asking what happened in Smyrna and who caused the fire that burned the consulate. He was told they didn't know. The situation was confused and they didn't have reliable information. So the U.S. State Department lied to Congress. Sounds familiar? That's why I call it Smyrna Gate. The injustice and economic motivations of American government policy did not go completely unnoticed at the time. One of the most important attempts to expose what was going on was made by an insider, Edward Hale Bierstadt, who had served as executive secretary of the Emergency Committee of the Near Eastern Refugees. In 1924, he published a devastating account based on his experience and investigations entitled The Great Betrayal, a survey of the Near Eastern problem. By the way, also recently reprinted and published by the Pontians here in the United States. His account largely agrees with many other confidential and secret documents I have discussed above. Also with the work of U.S. Consul Fortin, The Blight of Asia, which he only was able to publish after he retired. As we all know, Turkey still officially denies that any genocide took place. Even though, I'm almost done, some courageous Turkish intellectuals, and we've got one here, have raised doubts about the truth of the official version of this dark page of their country's past. When my Greek relatives visited our lost homeland near Smyrna, the Young Turks they encountered asked them, "Why did you leave?" As if they did it by choice. Additionally, although the U.S. government still refuses to recognize the murder of Anatolian Christians as genocide, 21 other countries have done so, and 43 states in the U.S. have passed resolutions granting recognition in one form or another. As Israel Charney and other scholars have repeatedly pointed out, genocide denial is actually the last stage of genocide. A major accomplishment is that Thea Hallow and Adam Jones have managed to gain recognition of the Anatolian Greek and Pontian Genocide from 1914 to 1923 by the International Association of Genocide Scholars, who adopted a resolution giving it equal status to that of Ottoman Armenians and Assyrians. It is remarkable that Thea, a non-academic, accomplished this on her own through her passion and zeal, without any substantial assistance from any Greek scholars. We all owe her a debt of gratitude and unbounded admiration. The continued denial, the continued denial of genocide by Turkey is not only a failure to come to terms with past actions, but continues them into the present. It is only by a recognition of the truth that nations and victims can move on and that any healing can take place. Thank you for your kind attention.
Next, we will present proclamation and statements from Carolyn B. Maloney, Member of Congress, and Luda Bakis, Senator of the State of Rhode Island. Elias Neofytides will read the statement from Congresswoman Carolyn B.
I don't have an
Maloney.
extra. I'll email it to you.
In recognition of the Pan-Pontian Federation of the United States and Canada of the 95th Annual Day of Remembrance of the Pontian Greek victims of genocide. Mr. Speaker, I rise in remembrance of the 95th anniversary of the Pontian Greek genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century. From 1914 to 1923, there was a concerted campaign to eliminate Pontian Greeks and other Christians from lands controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Today we commemorate the genocide of May 19th, the date in 1919 when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the leader of the Young Turks and the founder of modern-day Turkey, initiated the second phase of the genocide against the city of Samsun on the Black Sea. The Pan-Pontian Federation of the United States of America and Canada works tirelessly to preserve the history and tradition of the Pontian Greeks and raise awareness about the genocide of its people. The Pontian Greeks trace back their origins nearly 3 millennia to the region on the southeastern coast of the Black Sea, known as Pontos Espinos, or Hospitable Sea. Surrounded by the Black Sea and Pontic Alps, the Pontian Greeks have developed a long and distinguished history and a proud culture. The Pontian Greeks have upheld Hellenic traditions with pride, even in the face of discrimination and horrific violence. The motives behind the Pontian genocide can be traced back to the decline of the Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 20th century. The ensuing rise of nationalism incited revolutionary wars and independence movements within the decaying Ottoman Empire, causing Turkish leaders to become increasingly fearful that their ethnically diverse domain would begin to disintegrate. In the early 20th century, the Young Turk movement ushered in a new nationalistic and ethnocentric ideology in the Ottoman Empire. After centuries of living in the region, establishing commercial trading routes, developing mining and agricultural industries, and creating urban centers, the Armenians and Pontian Greeks became victims to a ferocious genocide of their Christian populations. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children were forced to leave their homes and were deported on foot in large groups. They were subjected to starvation, execution, and mass rapes during their deadly journey. The intent to destroy the Pontian community was clear, as Ottoman forces proceeded to massacre populations and burn down Greek churches, monasteries, and entire villages. The genocide resulted in the massacre and displacement of about 1.5 million Greeks, half of whom were of the Pontian region. The roughly 400,000 Pontians who did survive were exiled from their ancestral homes, many fleeing to Greece, Russia, and the United States. Despite the Pontians' history of persecution, their traditions and cultures are still celebrated around the world. The determination, endurance, and resiliency of the Pontian Greeks serve as a testament to mankind's extraordinary ability to defy all odds and overcome adversity. Mr. Speaker, I ask that my distinguished colleagues join me in honoring the victims of the Pontian Genocide and recognizing the Pan-Pontian Federation of the United States of America and Canada for its vital work to preserve Pontian Greek culture and history. Caroline B. Maloney.
Now, Alexandros Stefanidis will read the resolution from the state of Rhode Island.
This is the Senate resolution proclaiming May 19th of 2014 as Greek Pontian Genocide Remembrance Day in the state of Rhode Island. Whereas Rhode Island is proud to be the home of numerous ethnic communities, many of whom have prospered and enjoyed the freedom and democracy upon which our nation was founded. Tragically, throughout history, the people of many countries have not realized the same autonomy and equality. And whereas, from 1914 until 1922, in a systematic attempt to exterminate an entire population, the Ottoman Turks directed the killing of 353,000 Pontian and Anatolian Greeks and over 1 million Armenians and Assyrians living in Pontos, and an equal number who were forced to flee their homeland in one of the most condemnable atrocities in the history of the world. And whereas the Ottomans and Kemal Neo-Turks engaged in exile, starvation, slaughter, and murder, using axes and fire to massacre the Pontic Greek population and perpetrate the first mass genocide of the 20th century. And whereas it is vital and proper to remember those who lost their lives in the Pontian Genocide, and it is paramount that the people of all nations look at this horrific event in our world, not so distant history, as a way to learn a valuable lesson so that such atrocities are not tolerated and are never committed again. And whereas it is likewise important to pay tribute to the survivors of the atrocious period, as well as their descendants who have made countless contributions to the enrichment of our culture and our way of life here in the Ocean State, and who stand as an inspiration to oppressed people around the world. Now, therefore, it be resolved that this Senate of the State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations hereby joins the Greek American community on May 19th of each year in a solemn commemoration of the Pontian Genocide of 1914 to 1922. And it be further resolved that the Secretary of State and hereby is authorized and directed to transmit a duly certified copy of this resolution to the Pan-Pontian Federation of USA.
We now have a short introductory video of upcoming documentary, Preserving the Memory of the Anatolian Greek Genocide, the Great Catastrophe, Forgotten Genocide by the Asia Minor and Pontos Hellenic Research. Republic of Greece in New York. Father John Amaratidis from St. Nectarios in Brooklyn. And of course, the presidents of the Pontian organization co-sponsoring this event. Mr. Elias Neofytides, president of Komnoini, New York. Mr. George Tsipridis, president of Pontos, Norma, Connecticut. And Dr. Charalambos Vasiliadis, president of the Holy Institution Panagia Soumela. And our speakers, Dr. Akshman, Dr. Chazi Dimitriou, and Mr. Papadopoulos. Also here with us today, and we thank them, Professor Christos Ioannidis, the director of the Center for Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies at Queens College, author of Thea Halo, daughter of Sano Halo, of the book Not Even My Name. Dimitris Molochidis, vice president of the Worldwide Confederation of Pontian Hellenists and past president of our federation. Elias Neofytides, President of the Federation of Greek Societies of Greater New York and past President of our Federation. Elias Neofytides, Emeritus President and founder of the Pan-Macedonian Studies Center, and all the reporters and journalists from the media. Apostolos Panagiotis, Panikos Panagiotou, Kostas Bey, Kostas Bey, Dinos Sirokos, and Fotis Papagermanos. It is now my honor to present the President of the Pontian Federation of USA and Canada for his closing remark.
Finally, thank you for your patience. First of all, my sincerest apologies for running a little bit long again, but as we all know, being Greek, we enjoy the journey rather than the destination. So we should be happy in that. When the journey is over, there's a sort of sadness then that it is over. So we accomplished our goal as Greeks. On behalf of the Pontian Federation of the United States and Canada, I would like to thank everyone for attending this evening's event. And I would like to extend an invitation to everyone here to attend our other events that we have planned this weekend. There will be a Vespers and Memorial service tomorrow night at 7 p.m. at the Holy Institution Panagios Koumela in West Milford, New Jersey, followed by a wreath-laying ceremony and a gathering at the institution's hall, honoring the memory of the 353,000 souls of our ancestors. On Sunday, there will be memorial services held at local churches with arrangements made by Pontian societies throughout the United States and Canada. In New York, it will be held at Ayia Katerini, and in Norwalk at St. George. On Monday, May 19th, which is the official day of commemoration, at noon, we will have a flag-raising ceremony at Bowling Green Park in Manhattan, which will be attended by members of the Federation and several dignitaries who will speak in honor of the occasion. I want to thank our two distinguished speakers, Dr. Taner Akçam and Dr. Gus Hatzidimitriou, for their most enlightening presentations, and our wonderful poet, Stefanos Papadopoulos, who conjured up visions of our grandparents as they must have been in Pontus. There are also a few people present tonight who were very instrumental in the planning and coordinating of this event, and I want to express my personal gratitude to them. Obviously, the two local societies, Pontian Society Komnoini of New York and their president, Yannis Kotaridis, Pontian Society Pontus of Norwalk and the president, George Tsilfidis. Of course, Mr. Papa Konstantinou, our host, the Greek Consulate and the Permanent Mission to the UN, Mr. Elias Neofytides, President of the Federation of Hellenic Societies, and also former President of the Pontian Federation of the USA and Canada, and his staff for helping us secure any and all permits required for the events of the entire weekend. Dr. Charalabos Vasiliadis, President of the Holy Institution Panagios Koumela, who is always willing to lend his support. His assistance in drafting press releases, program planning, and his technical advice have been heavily relied upon by me personally during the planning stages for these events. Thank you, Charalabos. Former President of the Pontian Federation, Dimitris Molachidis. I feel very fortunate to have not only a former president who has the experience and the know-how to put these events together, but a true friend who is willing to share that knowledge gladly. I can't tell you the number of times I have interrupted his work with phone calls or emails, not to mention the number of times I showed up at his lab unannounced to discuss Federation events. Thank you, Dimitri, from the bottom of my heart. You can relax for a couple of weeks after Monday, but only for a few weeks. The youth festival is coming up. My apologies to anybody that we have unwittingly failed to mention. Anyone present here? My two special readers, thank you, Thea Hallow. Thea Hallow, I did not mention you. I've become accustomed to your face, so I maybe at fault sometimes of overlooking you because I see you so often, and I'm glad that I see you so often, but thank you. Finally, briefly, and I know that the journey is coming to an end, so you're all going to be sad, so I'm going to... on the subject of tonight's conference, I would like to reiterate that the recognition of the Pontian Greek genocide by Turkey and by the worldwide community is a goal that the Pan-Pontian Federation of the United States and Canada has been and will continue to strive for. We consider it not only our right, but a responsibility and an honor-bound duty that we owe to our ancestors who paid the ultimate price for their faith and their nationality. The crime that was perpetrated on the 353,000 Greeks of Pontus, along with the 1.5 million Armenians, and by most accounts nearly 500,000 Assyrians, and more than 1 million Greeks in total, by definition, as outlined by the International Association of Genocide Scholars, constitutes genocide. Denial is the last stage of genocide. Therefore, it is also a crime. Likewise, it is wrong for these events to be erased from the history books or to be misrepresented. And silence is tantamount to approval and complicity. Thus, we vow to continue the struggle until recognition is achieved worldwide and justice is served. We will not remain silent. Thank you.